Anyway, let's go ahead with our work. So we have 10.2. 10.2 imeshikana, hii yangu imeshikana hii. Nafikiri I push this one down a little bit. So that yeah, kwa mzuri sasa. 10.2.
10.3.
10.2. 10.3 is still country.
Scarce.
So I go to caps now. Caps. 4.6. Caps wamejaza hiyo kweli? Wamejaza?
Check.
This is 12, 11, wamejaza 10.9.
10.9.
Wamejaza 10.3.
10.3.
Ndio tulikuwa tunatafuta, not 10.2.
10.2. Okay. Country.
Okay.
Well,
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
hi, welcome.
Hi, Peter. Hi,
Hey,
Sylvester.
good to
Hi,
see you.
everyone.
Hi, Jane.
Good to see friends. Hi, Sylvester.
Good to hear from you.
Good to hear from you too. Hi, Sheikh. Wow. So, Sylvester, do we start? You let me know when we are.
Sorry,
we can
because of the
start.
change of the link, we are trying to give about some 5 minutes for the people to do the switchover. So they give some
Okay.
5 minutes and we'll start.
Okay, okay then.
Thank you.
Hello, Sylvester.
Hello, Sheikh. Welcome.
Good morning. Or good afternoon, if you so. How are you?
I'm fine, Sheikh.
Okay, good. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah.
Michelle Sheikh, I can hear you too.
Hey, Michelle Tete Ormeku.
Hey, wow.
My brother, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Where is my palava sauce? Don't forget to send it.
In fact, we've developed a virtual Balaba source. You can
Okay,
send by internet.
virtual palava sauce. Yeah, okay, it's fine for now. So how is it in Accra?
Everything is okay. It's okay
Wonderful.
now.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Wonderful.
And Dakar?
Good. Okay, fine. Not bad. A bit hot now.
No, I understand.
Rainy season is coming, but we don't have yet any rain, so it's a bit hot.
Okay, we have the rain, but it's still hot.
All right. Yeah. It's the time for that. It's the season. Yeah.
Okay. See
Okay.
you soon.
Good. Good.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Ambassador.
Hi, good afternoon, Ambassador.
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you too.
Nice to see you too.
Wonderful. Hello.
Hi, Tete.
So all the presenters are here now. It's okay.
Yes.
I'm just waiting for some participants.
A few more participants because of the last minute change of link.
Okay.
But we have quite a number, so I suppose
Okay.
it may be good to start.
I have seen 39 participants, which is a quite good number.
Yes, very encouraging. It's actually
very encouraging.
At first, we have about 80 people register, so hopefully the audience.
I'm sure they are still coming, so it's good.
And check this morning, we had about 92 participants registering.
Okay. That's good. Very good number.
Hello, Sylvester.
Hello, Bernard.
Yeah, sorry. How?
We are very fine.
Great.
Did you guys get my presentation?
Hello, Ambassador.
Hi, Sylvester. Did you get my presentation?
Yes, please.
Oh,
you can
great.
actually share from your screen, or I can share from here.
Okay. How do
we
I
have
do
allowed
that?
I haven't done that restrictions so that you can share from your PC, on your screen.
I've got it on my screen, but I don't know how to get it onto the Zoom thing.
If you click on share screen.
Where at the top?
After the chat, share screen.
Below at the bottom of the thing, there's participants, chat, share screen, record, those buttons.
All right.
Right.
Does that do it?
Yes.
Exactly.
I see. I learn something every day.
we are all doing the same thing. This is coronavirus is teaching us new tricks.
the new abnormal.
Okay, maybe it's Sylvester.
Okay, I think we can.
Do you think we can start? Yeah.
I think we can start. We have about 42 participants. We can start. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for taking your time to be in this webinar. Let me first of all apologize for the change of link. We had a difficulty with the Teams. And we very much appreciate your presence in this webinar. My name is Sylvester Bagoro, Program Officer, Third World Network Africa, based in Accra, Ghana. And we're also the Secretariat of the Africa Trade Network. I would like to call the meeting to order and welcome all of you to today's webinar that will center on the global development, Africa responses, and Africa's continental free trade area. In fact, this is part of a series of webinars that TWN Africa is organizing on the overall policy context of the AfCFTA and the various dimensions of the AfCFTA. In all, there'll be 5 webinars. So this is the first one. So today's one will look at the developments in the global policy landscape and its implication for the AfCFTA, especially in the light of the COVID pandemic, how Africa has responded so far, and what it means for the AfCFTA as an African regional strategic initiative to deal with Africa's developmental challenges. The second webinar will look at the specific provisions of the concluded protocols on goods and the protocol on services, and ask whether in the context of the challenges exposed by the pandemic, the protocols as agreed, will they measure up to the task of transforming African economies, which continue to exhibit features of weak economies. The third and the fourth webinars will look at the yet to be negotiated protocols, which are investment and intellectual property and competition policy. And we are going to ask questions whether there are lessons to be learned, to be learned in terms of the process and the content in those ones that are yet to be negotiated. The last webinar will take on the issues of continental rules for e-commerce that are being envisaged for the third phase of the AfCFTA and the whole digital transformation in Africa. That is the issues of the fourth industrial revolution, what people call Industry 4.0. So this is a package that we have, and we'll take them one after the other. Of course, the schedule will be announced as it approaches. But before I hand over to the moderator for the day, let me say that we try to get simultaneous interpretation in both French and English, but that did not materialize. In fact, the technology did not help us. So we hope that the subsequent ones, the technology will afford us the ability to do so. So let me now hand over to the moderator for the day, who is Ms. Jane Anuga. She is the country director for the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute based in Uganda. So Jane, I hand over the moderation to you. Jane is well experienced to handle this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvester, and thank you so much for that confidence in me. You are most welcome, all our participants. Let me first of all welcome you all to this webinar. Let me also thank TWN for organizing this webinar, but also organizing the whole entire series of the webinars, as Sylvester has told us. For me, I believe that Sorry, we are having some challenges. So I believe that these webinars will be able to help us to interrogate the CFTA and to be able to ensure that the CFTA works for Africa and for the African people. As Sylvester has pointed out, Jane Narunga, the country director of CIATIN Uganda. CIATIN is also a member of the ATN. The presenters we have for today's webinar, which is Global Development, Africa Responses and the CFTA, are very seasoned experts in the area of trade and trade negotiations. But before I introduce to you the presenters, I would like to pass through the program, today's program. We have already done the introduction and context setting by Sylvester, TWN. The next item on the agenda is remarks by moderator, and we are going to have a presentation on the global developments, on the policy landscape, responses and implications for the CFTA, perspectives from South Africa by Ambassador Xavier Karim. Then we also have a presentation by Dr. Sheikh Die, Executive Director, ENDA, on global developments on the policy landscape, responses and implications for the CFTA, perspectives from the rest of Africa. Then we are going to have a discussant, Mr. Tete Homeku, and then we'll open up for discussions. Briefly, I would also like to spell out the ground rules. One, please mute your phone, microphone, if you are not talking. Then two, we are going to have all the presentation and the discussant, and then we'll have questions and discussions after. If you want to make, to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. You can go to participant. That's where you will see where you can be able to raise your hand. Then also, we have a chat box, and we'll be able to give the presenter and the discussant those questions. So without much ado, I would like to call upon Ambassador Xavier to make his presentation. Ambassador Xavier Karim is the Deputy Director General for International Trade and Economic Development at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa. He's responsible for managing South Africa's international trade and investment policy engagement. His portfolio includes leading South Africa's trade negotiation at multilateral, regional, and bilateral level. He was South Africa's permanent representative to the WTO from 2014 to 2018. Ambassador Xavier Karim's CV is really long. He's an expert in this area, so I haven't done justice to it given that time. So Ambassador Xavier, the floor is yours, and could you please make your presentation in 20 minutes time?
Thank you very much, moderator. I hope, first of all, you can all hear me. When you do the share screen, I lose the controls. Can you hear me?
Let me see.
Yes,
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Well, let me just start by thanking you, moderator. Thank you for the kind introduction. And really thanks to the Third World Network Africa, my old friend Tete, for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and I'm really happy to see so many old friends on this platform. I wanted to get straight to the presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions later on. But of course, the presentation itself covers an enormous amount of ground, so it's at a fairly high level. And of course, there are many details that we can elaborate and discuss afterwards. The presentation itself, which I hope you had all received and perhaps even circulated, it's about 5 areas, and it starts off with some idea about the origins of unbalanced globalization, and particularly focusing on the work in the WTO, some of the risks that are emerging, some of the responses at the global level that we're beginning to see. Excellent. And then come to the African response, including with respect to the
yes, I did. It's the cover. It's the cover.
Yes.
So this is
okay. So covering quite a lot of ground, and let me just get straight into it. I think generally there is a widespread recognition that that there is a crisis in multilateralism in general. And this is also reflected in the WTO, in the workings of the WTO. And if you try to get to the bottom of it, you would probably find that the crisis at the WTO is embedded in the policies that are part of the legal commitments that we all undertook in joining the WTO back in 1994. And in broad terms, we could argue that that agreement, along with a number of other developments globally, has fostered an unbalanced globalization in which we've seen a massive extension of global markets, massive increases in trade, in investment flows, in services, in the area of services and others. We've also seen stronger intellectual property rights arising from that agreement. We've these extensions of markets and trade, the benefits increasingly accrue to a narrower sectors of our losses and job insecurity developing. And what that has done is it's led to in the recent years, to a backlash against globalization, against trade, and against the WTO. And we've seen this particularly in many countries in the North. What that has led to are changes in the terms of engagement in the WTO by some important economies. Now, that recent realization of development in the North follows what we in many parts of the developing world have experienced since the time of the establishment of the WTO, and what we had argued for many, many years is that the agreements that come out of the Uruguay round prejudice our interests and our trade and development objectives. There are a range of, you could go through many, many of the agreements in the WTO and you could find specific references, but maybe some of the most important are the view from many developing countries that they gave extensive concessions to in opening up their markets during the in accepting the Uruguay round agreements, but they've not seen the same level of access into in products of interest to them. We see all of the imbalances in agriculture that continue, the massive support that developed countries can provide to their farmers, and the constraints that we have in developing countries to deal with more urgent matters of food security. We see imbalances in the way industrial subsidies are applied. Many of the types of subsidies that we would need to support our industries, those subsidies are prohibited or constrained. But developed countries have extensive scope to provide massive support to high-tech, knowledge-intensive industries, which are where they focus their efforts. And the other major point I would highlight is that the intellectual property rights regime has not only facilitated monopoly rents and great returns for companies and firms that hold those rights, but that they diminish the possibilities for technology transfer, which is essential to spread growth and development more widely. For many of us that have been around for some time, the Doha round, with all its problems, at least had some acknowledgement that these were imbalances that needed to be addressed. But the promise that was contained in the Doha round, in the Doha declaration and the Doha mandate, the negotiations on that has been frustrated. So those concerns of developing countries remain. In the last couple of years, and this was really during the period that I was based in Geneva, there were a number of developments more recently that pose a range of new risks to the trading system, and have sharpened the contestation and the difficulties and challenges that are being faced. We've seen an uptake of an increase in unilateral actions, particularly with one member in particular overshooting the legal commitments that we all signed on to in terms of tariffs, the levels of tariffs. They've raised their tariffs in some sectors beyond that. And they've also applied those higher tariffs in a very selective way, which means that not only have they violated, there's a violation of the tariff ceiling commitments, but also in the way, on the MFN principle, where you're supposed to treat everyone the same. In the last few years, at least since 2017, after the meeting in Buenos Aires, the ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires in December 2017, we've seen a proliferation of attempts to start negotiations among small groups of countries, not the full membership, and without mandates of the WTO, in a series of plurilaterals negotiations in e-commerce, investment facilitation, and there are a number of others. And this challenges another one of the sort of cornerstones of the way the WTO works is that decisions are taken by consensus. The proliferation of of plurilaterals poses a risk to that. What has also been more prominent, and I think most of the colleagues would see this it's regularly in the media, a series of proposals to narrow the scope of application of the principles of special and differential treatment, which provides some degree of flexibility to developing countries in taking on commitments at the multilateral level. So the attempt is to narrow the scope of that flexibility in terms of which countries could benefit from that in future negotiations, and also in terms of the scope itself of those that actually do get it. There are a number of proposals in this respect. We've heard many indications and proposals. Not very much has been formalized, but that there's an effort to tighten rules on industrial subsidies, to further tighten rules on industrial subsidies, to further tighten rules on intellectual property that would make it more difficult to facilitate technology transfer. In a word, I hope I have not mistaken, but they had initially set out, the prospects were that trade was going to decline between 20 and 32% in 2020. This was in April sometime. Those figures are being revised from time to time, but that was the original sense, that there would be a massive decline in international trade. Now, while that has been happening, and while countries are still trying to manage the impact of the crisis, which is first and foremost a health crisis and has many other ramifications, they have about how we think that has been brought on by the pandemic, and many issues are raised, but I picked out about 3 that seem to be the most prominent lines of argument that emerge in terms of what a recovery, what it would contain. There's one line of thinking that appears to argue that the pandemic is going to last for some time, it will pass, and essentially what we need to do is to get back to business as usual, to restore global value chains, get them up and running. And then there's some notion about making them more resilient. And in large measure, this line of argument sees that making them more resilient is to make more global rules. On agriculture, electronic transactions have increased during the pandemic. So that's the argument, is that now you need to move faster on that. Arguments to speed up the implementation of the trade facilitation agreement and to liberalize trade in medical supplies, in PPEs, etc. So the notion is that that's how you make, that's one line of argument, is that's how you make it more resilient. There's been an interesting second line of argument, and this came from some of the big economies in the north, is that the pandemic has also exposed vulnerabilities to an over-dependence on imports from others. And so that line of argument seems to go in the direction that they need to bring more manufacturing back home, particularly in these critical product lines around health and medicines and medical supplies. But the sense is also in that this is, on the one hand, while you're looking to bring some manufacturing back home, you're also very much focused on trying to make sure that you keep global markets open for your exports. So this would not be applied necessarily in an even-handed manner. And then there's a third line of argument, and I could say that South Africa has taken this line in particular, is that resilience must mean that all of us have the opportunities and the possibility of building up our national and regional manufacturing capabilities, and that we need rules that are accommodating of that. More broadly, there is a discussion that is unfolding about future reform of the WTO. And this slide that I've just put up is trying to outline some broad thinking on what that could entail. I think we all recognize that a rules-based system is preferable to having interactions without any rules, where power reigns in relations between countries. But I think we also need to say that defending the rules-based system does not mean accepting inherited inequities in the rules that we identified earlier, or any new proposals that could worsen imbalances. There's a number of developing countries that have signed on to an approach that says any WTO reform must be more inclusive, must aim at more inclusivity, must be more developmental, and should respond to the underlying causes of the backlash against trade. And essentially what this means is that we need to have more space to pursue national industrialization in a broad framework of international cooperation. We need to address the rules that constrain our industrial policy and that limit technology transfer. We need a better assessment of not only the benefits of liberalization, but also the costs. And we should be recognizing the importance of flexibility. Again, many of these points are reflected in the developmental agenda of Doha, and so they remain relevant. Coming to the African response, and I hope I'm not going to overshoot my time, Chair. A good place to start to think about it is the AU Agenda 2063, which I think is quite a comprehensive assessment of Africa's challenges and what needs to be done. Of course, it's very broad and it needs to be implemented. But what strikes me in that agenda is the importance that it gives to structural transformation, industrial development, and diversification objectives for the continent. It recognizes Africa's overdependence on commodity, low value added products for export. We all recognize Africa's share of world trade is very small, that most of our trade is with external partners, and that our structure of trade is overwhelmingly in minerals, in oil, in ores, low value added products, and that this needs to change. I've made these two other points in this about the importance of Africa, pointing in the direction of the importance of Africa for African producers because most of a larger share of our exports amongst each other is in value-added manufactured products. And this draws on work that was done by UNCTAD some years back. We haven't updated the figures, but the main points are that if you were to exclude, for instance, from the calculation of oil, which dominates the aggregate figures of Africa's Africa's trade profile, if you were to take oil out for a minute, what you find is for African countries, other African markets are the second most important market for African producers. And at least 7 countries include other African countries as their most important export market. The other important point is we trade amongst each other in a much greater proportion of value-added products that are necessary to drive our industrialization and diversification objectives. The other point that the UNCTAD report from some years back pointed out to, and I know that this is still the case, is most of our trade, 3/4 of our trade amongst ourselves takes place within regional blocks. The other very important point to make, and I think this is something that we have to really take to heart, is that the barriers to trade in Africa, to intra-Africa trade, is not simply about tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but it is real economy productive constraints. We simply don't produce enough supply diversity of products that can increase our trade. So we have underdeveloped production structures. We also have weak infrastructure linking our economies. And so we've been proposing, and it's well captured in Agenda 2063, that we need a broader approach that combines not only the market integration agenda, which we see as the main function of the African continental free trade area. We need to complement that with real programs for cross-border infrastructure connectivity and industrial policy cooperation. Just a couple of slides with the background on the AfCFTA. I think most of the colleagues know all of this very well. That integration has been a long-standing objective for Africa. It's embedded in the at the time of the creation of the OEU in 1963, and seen as essential to overcome the limitations of small, fragmented economies. Most of the progress in the continental agenda has been registered at subcontinental levels in the various RECs that we have, and of course the progress is quite uneven in that respect, but there has been progress in those areas. And essentially the AfCFTA aims to build on these regional, on the RECs in forging a continental integration project. We know that the negotiations on the AfCFTA were launched in 2015, that the legal instruments, the formal legal instruments, were concluded and agreed in 2018. Then in 2019, in July, just a year ago, there was a discussion to launch what they call the operational phase. We know that 54 countries have signed the agreement, just 28 have ratified. And so we're very much focused now on the operationalization of the agreement. And there are basically 3 or 4 core elements. I mean, they're quite significant, but essential elements that we need to focus on to get the agreement operationalized. And that has to do with submitting offers, negotiating offers on tariff reductions. And there we have a long way to go. Of course, the members that can negotiate have to have ratified the agreement. And so it's not a negotiation as yet amongst the entire membership. It's 28 members that have ratified. And of the 28, only 11 have submitted offers for negotiation. So we have something of quite a shortfall in that respect. Then we have unfinished negotiations on rules of origin. We're also supposed to conclude negotiations on services in 5 sectors, and as it stands now, just 6 AU members have submitted offers on that. So again, really a long way to go before we can say that the agreement is operationalized. And coming with the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, the deadlines for all that had been set originally have had to be pushed back, and the idea now is that we aim to try to get to operationalize these by January next year. Some of the real difficulties there, I just highlighted a few, what I see to be some of the real difficulties in going forward. The first one, I mean, this is not in any order necessarily, but one big issue that seems to be, will require dedicated attention is what constitutes appropriate rules of origin. How much of the traded products to qualify for the preferences, how much of that has to be of African content, and how much of that would we allow inputs from outside of the continent. And that would tell you to what extent the benefits of the AfCFTA accrue to African producers as opposed to producers from outside of the continent. There's a great concern amongst many members about the risk of transshipment, that third parties outside of the continent will use the CFTA and enjoy the benefits of that. And all of this requires that we have very effective customs capacity to monitor transshipment, to monitor and enforce rules of origin. This is a big issue. I think it wouldn't be a surprise to many to say that one of the big gaps in the negotiations has been the fact that Nigeria is not part of, has not yet ratified the agreement and therefore not part of the negotiations. And that has an implication for ECOWAS's participation. And that is one of the major participants in this negotiation. I think the other important point is that one of the principles in the AfCFTA is that we were not going to use the negotiations of the AfCFTA to try to fix problems that we had at the sub-regional level. So for instance, in SADC, we were not going to have a new negotiations among SADC members. We would preserve that REC, and we would be looking for agreement almost at a REC-to-REC level where they exist. And so this is an issue that we have to focus on. Otherwise, the negotiations could become completely unmanageable. Of course, the risks, we know that trade liberalization involves gains and losses, and that how we manage those and how the benefits are shared, how the costs are shared is going to be critical to the sustainability of the agreement. We need to think about that. Some of the bigger economies like South Africa would stand to gain, but it's not going to be sustainable if benefits are not shared by all members. And so we need to pay a lot of attention to how we manage that. One of the important things that we need to think about is, as we are integrating and opening our markets to one another, the question is, how do we respond to what is our trade policy stance vis-a-vis outside players like the EU, like the US, and this has an implication for the integration project at the Africa level. And the US-Kenya proposed FTA is one issue that we have to focus on now and understand what the implications of that are. The other has been an indication. I mean, I don't think there's a formal proposal, but an indication for an FTA between Africa and the EU. Again, we need to pay attention to what the implications of that are for our own integration process. This slide is just highlighting some of the immediate challenges that we're facing as Africa as a result of
Ambassador, as you wind up.
Yeah. I will, let me just wind up now. We just have, I think this is the last, if not the second last slide. This slide just highlights some of the reasons for the deep decline in Africa's economic performance. UNCTAD and IMF proposal on what Africa would need for its recovery. And then I think this could very well be the last slide. Yes, it is. That I think the pandemic has again exposed Africa's vulnerabilities, that we need to build more national and regional capacity, and then the points that I'd made earlier. So operationalization of the AfCFTA would take us a step closer to realizing the vision of an integrated African market. Chair, I hope I didn't go too far over. If I did, my apologies, but I'm done now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Karim. A very, very well laid out presentation, giving us the global dynamics and also giving pointers of what we really need to do to make our CFTA work. Given the limited time, and I'm so sorry, Ambassador, I pushed you to wind up, but it was such a very great presentation. Now I want to turn to the second presenter, my friend Sheikh Dear. Sheikh is an activist and a trade expert. His CV is very He's also the executive director at CACID, and he also worked at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development in Geneva. He has been giving lectures. He's a visiting lecturer in many universities, even in East Africa here. Some of us have seen him in Trapka, also in Abidjan, and also visiting lecturer in a summer school in Montreal. As I have pointed out, Sheikh is an expert, but he's also an activist, as he's a very active member of the ATN. I think I'll better stop there, Sheikh. So Sheikh is going to make a presentation on global developments on the policy landscape, and for the perspective of Africa. Sheikh, the floor is yours, please. And you have 20 minutes. Please unmute. Unmute your mic.
All right. Okay, thank you. I'm in now. Yeah, thank you very much, Jane. Thank you. Very happy to see you.
You have 20 minutes.
Okay, it's fine. I'm very, very happy to see you this afternoon. Thank you also to Ambassador Karim. Thank you, and congratulations to TWN Africa for organizing this meeting on AfCFTA and all the stakes and challenges around this important agreement for Africa. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I have a Word one, but I will send it to Sylvester Bagoro later on when I will finish translate it into English. But if Sylvester, if you want, I can also send it to you in French, and you take you translate it into English and send to participants. Following the ambassador, I want just to start my my speech on putting the frame and asking some questions in introduction by saying what has changed and what will happen next. First of all, we can see that this crisis of COVID-19 reveals some truths that we can all see or understand. The first is that nothing can ever be taken for granted, and that humanity, despite the technical and technological progress that we have, we remains very vulnerable to multi-phased crises that cannot be seen before they come. We've seen with this crisis that all of us, the humanity, all countries, despite our technological progress, we're still very vulnerable. I think that is important because all the leaders in the world, in Africa and elsewhere, when they put into in place some agreements, policy, public policies, and so on, they should take into account from now the fact that they can face or they may face some challenges just 1 year after. The second truth is that globalizations or globalization, mondialization in France, once seen as a kind of panacea, has also reveals its weaknesses, because some of the positive dependencies that were seen by many in the area of production of goods and services are in reality, this globalization can be source of vulnerability or dependency. You see now most of the countries are saying they want to relocalization of their production, not from Asia, but in their own countries. You see, this globalization is questioned now. We can see that also the third one is that local needs, most often related to health, education, agriculture, food, energy, water, sanitation, and so on. These local needs must be met at local or national or at least regional level. Most of the needs we have in this area of health, education, and so on, we are seeing that it should be better for us when we try to get there, to solve them in national or local, in local area, national or regional, because it will reduce our vulnerability or our dependency to the global market, which sometimes dependency to far countries, which is difficult for us when we want to import these essential or very crucial goods for our economies and for our people. There is also another truth that the fact that we thought, all of us, that the international solidarity, the cooperation, all these big principles or concepts that used to be discussed in international conferences, now we are saying that we are all seeing that the reality is that it's not really every time there. When there is this kind, we face this kind of crisis, sometimes all the countries, even the most developed one, they try to face or to solve their own problem in their own country. I'm sure you are aware of the decision taken by France, saying that they would not export their medicines to Africa or to Senegal when we are asking them to export here some chloroquine and so on. And as far as Africa is concerned, I think that today, more than ever, we must rely on ourselves and do things in our own way, and building on our projects in accordance with taking into account our strengths and our weaknesses. Now, I think with this crisis, we know our weaknesses, and we should from now know that we should build on our own way. We have our African 2063 agenda and many other strategies and objectives in Africa. We should rely on them, and we should build on our own way. And the last truth that we can see from this, I think, is that the industrialization of our continent and our development should also rely to our indigenous production process, and based on what we can afford and what we can do. Waiting only for the external investor to come and not putting priority on our domestic investors, how to mobilize our own capital and etc. to invest in our priority sectors is, I think, something that should be learned as a lesson to take into account from now, and in order to know that if Africa will be industrialized, it should be done based on our domestic and indigenous production processes and our own weaknesses and strengths, because we know that our market is huge and we can also build our industry on this. So given this context, I think that coming to the AfCFTA, we should rethink it in an appropriate manner, and to see that from now, we should see that instead of just saying we will go in the same dimension, in the same direction, in the same way to implement the AfCFTA, doing as if nothing has happened, we should say we have to look at this agreement, to assess it, and to see what have to be kept, what do we have to change, and what do we have to remove from it. Perhaps, I don't know yet, I can't say that we have to remove something, but I am saying that we should assess it, we should look at it, we should perhaps, and if we do so, we will perhaps see that something is to be kept there, which is good, something has to change, but perhaps we can remove something. So I'm saying that we should take this opportunity to assess better, not only saying that everything is fine, we have signed, so let's implement it as it was. Perhaps we will need to change this or that in this agreement, but we have to look at this way. I think from now, from this agreement, if we go through in the way of the implementation of the AfCFTA, we have to take into account the context, the global context, because we are putting this agreement in the context of a changing world, which has started to be changed, but these changes will be accelerated perhaps by this COVID-19 crisis. And the first, I think, element of this context, the first factor to take into account in this global governance is, I think, what is happening in the global trading system, in the global trade of exchanges and so on. Ambassador Karim showed some facts and figures on what is happening in the global trading system, but the governance of the trading system has also to be taken into account, and we should start by looking at WTO. We should recognize that before the destruction of these economies, the disruption or the problems we are facing because of this COVID-19, temptations to return to protectionism was there already. It was evident. WTO was in the crossroad, if not in the impasse. And some countries accused the US of protectionism because you know that the American president is somebody who is very famous. But even those countries who was accusing US, some of them, in some of their actions, they were kind of protectionism because many countries were going this way. So we should take that into account, knowing that the multilateralism is in the crossroad, and Africa should know how to position itself on this debate. And I want to talk about this debate in the table about who will be the next director of WTO. It is a debate in Africa. In my view, we are going the wrong direction because most of the countries are saying who will be the candidate of Africa. Should it be the Kenyan or Nigeria or anywhere else, Egyptian? I think the good question should not be who will be the chair of WTO, would it be an African or not, but what should be the place of Africa? What Africa cost in the global trading system? And in the next WTO, we want to build what should be the place, the role of African countries. What we know our weaknesses we had inside, the challenges, we did not play very strong role. We had many problems with the dispute settlement body that we never have capacities to move. So the idea is, in these global challenges, based on what we are doing in Africa on the AfCFTA, what new position should we have to be stronger, to talk in one voice, to come together in WTO and to define what is important for Africa, not only what is important for the others, like some sectoral services, some kind of agriculture for them. What is important for us, we should know and come in this debate. If we have the chair for WTO, it's fine, but for me, the most important is what position and what should we do in WTO. So this area of WTO is something very important to take into account, the changes that need to be put there, and how to make sure that our Africa will use all the policy spaces that we have already gained, but to widen them with the AfCFTA and with our national and regional policies that we should from now put in place to widen our options for industrialization for Africa, with how to deal with our trade barriers, how to deal with our custom duties among ourselves, how to build value chains among ourselves, and so on. So this trading system, the global one, is very important. But after WTO, what also needs to be taken into account, I think, is something that we have seen before this COVID-19, but perhaps which will be accelerated after, is this kind of proliferation, of the apparition of these mega regional trade agreements that we are seeing. Of course, they had some problems in this agreement from United States when Trump came to power, and some other challenges. But in the global frame, this is now a kind of reality in the global trading system, the apparition of mega trade agreements. And I think that after this COVID-19, most of them will be relaunched, and many countries will also go through them to deepen, because they will need to build on regions instead of only depending on global value chains. They will go through regional value chains, stronger, shorter, and they will do that. And so Africa have to take also into account the fact that these mega regional trade agreements will have an impact on what Africa wants to do for itself and for in the global trading system, but it will also have a kind of impact on how we should put in place our AfCFTA in the continental level. So after that level, we should also look at another space, another level of challenge on trade agreements, which is it's these famous EPAs that you know very well. My sister Jane, my brother Ken, Tete, and all the others members from ITN and others. We have been struggling for since 2000, 2001, and 2002 against these economic partnership agreement, because we was convinced, and we are still convinced, that these agreements are not good for Africa. But you have seen that EU is still pushing with a new strategy, putting pressure on some countries that have already signed, are implemented. And I think these also, we should have kind of response on this. For instance, here in West Africa, I'm sure you know it, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have already signed, implementing. Cote d'Ivoire have started applying EPA since 1st January 2019, last year. So, and this is having some impacts on the regional trade in West Africa. So what should be Africa's response? What should be our response to all of this? These crises have come very quickly, and nobody, I think, could know if it would happen. It took all of us by surprise. So our perception of the notion of time or urgency should also come when we talk about public policies, agreements, and so on. Our perception of time or urgency should change, I think. That's why, as Ambassador Karim said, when we're talking about postponing the implementation of AfCFTA to January 2021, I think it's necessary. We should be clear on that. It's necessary. But I am sure that it's not sufficient because from now to January, we have perhaps 6 months. What is it? Can we in 6 months discuss and clear all the things that are still challenging in the AfCFTA? And I'm not sure that we can. I'm saying that we should, from now, taking the lessons from the COVID, change our paradigm, not only rushing for political reasons. We should look at deeply, technically, what can be done, what is possible to allow us to come out with a very good, perhaps a slightly different agreement as CFTA, but that will be good for our people, not only for global business or global corporate and so on, but for our business, for people of Africa and so on. So we should, I think the first thing is to note that we should have this kind of flexibility. Perhaps 1 more year discussing would not be bad for us to solve all the problems that are in there. And many of these problems that I can tell you, I'm sure you know, from the last meeting held in that session of the head of states in February this year, a long list of challenge of things have still to be discussed. The issues should be resolved before the implementation. The first, the finalization of the negotiations of rule of origins, which is very important for Africa, for AfCFTA to be implemented, to be good. But there are still challenges. We have to negotiate that, finalize the negotiation of rule of origin. Second one, preparation and submission of list of tariff concession for trade in goods. In many regions, this is still a challenge. I will talk about later on for West Africa. We have to work on this to finalize and to put in the table. To prepare and submission of schedule of specific commitment for trade in services. The regulatory framework for services sectors. The incorporation of AfCFTA agreement into national laws, and so on. Production and dissemination of trade documents. Designation of national AfCFTA focal points in national level, establishment of national committees, custom management system and procedures, extension of AfCFTA and capacity building activities, and lastly, the 11th one, coordinate and implementation of monitoring of the AfCFTA. All these things are very challenging. They are very important, but I'm not sure that in 6 months from now to January, it will be possible to solve them. And we don't forget that we are talking about this AfCFTA, which is very ambitious, which will liberalize 90% of tariff lines, and the 10 remaining 3 will be sensitive products and will be excluded, and 7% will be sensitive products which will be liberalized gradually. So it's very ambitious, and this should be put in coherence with what is happening in the region. So I'm now talking on these challenges in the region, and that will be my last point. And I want to show you how it will be also difficult to put all these in place, to articulate them in order to really build on the regions and to strengthen the AfCFTA. We should recognize that despite the ambitions that we have, it is still difficult to see that the regions what the process of regional integration in the economy, how to put in coherence with the AfCFTA. That is what all our leaders are saying. The technicians, the negotiators are saying that we from civil society are pushing for articulation, coherence between AfCFTA and the regional, the REX trade system and so on. But it is more easy to say than to do, because we are seeing that even if AfCFTA wanted to build on the acquis of the regions and to take into account all the regions that are far in the front compared to the others, we should. It is said that these regions will keep what they have, their level of ambition, when they are clearly more ambition than what have been decided in the AfCFTA. But that we can see that some challenges are remaining there. If I give the example of ECOWAS region in West Africa, this AfCFTA will be linked to the common external tariff of ECOWAS, which is being implemented from since 2015, and which is organizing the external trade of the ECOWAS countries. When I talk about external trade, it includes the African countries. Before the AfCFTA, this CET was also the tool for organizing the trade with other African countries. And the second one, or the second trade policy instrument of ECOWAS is this trade liberalization scheme, the ETLS, which provides a preferential regime for approved companies originating in ECOWAS. So you see in ECOWAS region, we had these two instruments. How the AfCFTA will be linked to this, it is under debate. It is not very clear to all on how we will deal with this. In particular, when we know that the matter of rules of origin is something very important, both on these ETLS in West Africa, but also in AfCFTA, how to link these and to put coherence, it is a problem that have to be solved. And the other is, it is also necessary to take into account the fact that in some countries, the implementation even of the regional trade instruments or trade policy is still very weak. It is not very perfect. This common external tariff is being applied, but some challenges are still there and are not yet solved by the region. For the ETLS, it is much more complicated, because even if it is being implemented, we are still facing some kind of protectionism from some countries. We are still facing some non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers in the borders, making much more difficult to move a good from a country to another with these road harassments, corruption, and so on. So if we don't solve this, but even if you sign or ratify, implement the AfCFTA, it will come and reinforce another problems that were here and that have not been solved yet. And we will still have challenges to trade between the ECOWAS countries, and more problems between ECOWAS countries to the other African countries. So these have to be really put in the table and discussed very seriously. And ECOWAS have proposed a list of 184 tariff lines under the HS Code 2017 to be the one which will be excluded from the list of concession that will be given in the negotiation of AfCFTA. And these 184 have been discussed and have now to be linked with the ECOWAS offer, market access offer on the EPAs, even if it is not applied, for matter of coherency, and it have also to be put into place and in coherence with the other other issue and other trade policy instruments. So from now, Jane, I will stop here. What should be our approach from now to finalize this? As I said, the political leadership have been very strong in the AfCFTA. The process was very quick. I think this is the first time I see a dossier, an agreement negotiated and signed, ratified, and implemented or being implemented in a so quick or short time in Africa. I think it is a reason, it is a proof of leadership. But let's not forget that with what we are dealing with, like COVID, the global, the international crisis, and also the crisis of some of our economies that will come, we should not only do things because of our will to show that or to make sure that we want also only to show to others that we can make it. It's not a matter of showing anything. It is a matter of doing realistic. And I think it is now time to come back to discuss seriously, technically, and to assess what is in the table before going just for implementing what is already signed. I think we should rediscuss, even if there is nothing to change, but just let's go deeply on evaluation and to see what we will keep there and what should be removed from if need be. And I think we should also see that when we talk about AfCFTA to be implemented, there are, I think, some stakes which are very important to take into account. When we come to the regional, intra-regional trade for Africa, we all know that it is something very important for all of us. We have been advocating for that. If we were struggling against EPAs for so long time, it is not only we did not like Europe or to trade with Europe, it is that we were saying before signing anything with any partner, we should finalize building our African trade policy, our regional trade policy, strengthen intra-regional trade and intra-African trade. And when we become stronger, we can now negotiate and sign any agreement building on what we can gain or what we can give. So I think we should go this way and see that one of the main challenges or main stakes that we should take into account is that we should not fear of the future, because I think we have all the tools to build a good future for Africa based on the 2063 agenda, if you want, and going through our own domestic resources, domestic strategies, domestic natural resources, but only also build on the real needs. What are the real needs? With this COVID-19, we are seeing that the priority sector would not perhaps be for us building cars. What importance can have for an African country to build cars, to build, I think, to have very nice hotels when they are built or invested by foreign investors, when these countries in another way will import its food products, all the food products, will import medicines, will import all the things for health and so on. The priority that we should now see behind the AfCFTA will be how to build our regional value chains based on the short value chain, regional, on agro-food, med health, water, digital economy, and so on. So I will stop there, Jane. Sorry for being a bit long, but this is what I wanted to share with you this morning, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheikh, for a very great presentation, for also giving us pointers, especially as regards issues around rethinking, relooking, reassessing, and also looking at broadly on how we should be hello? Okay. At this time, material time, I wanted to call upon our discussant. Mr. Tete Homeku. Tete is also an expert in this area. He's an expert, and he's also the head of programs at TWN Africa. Tete, please.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you for the opportunity to be an expert, among experts. I thank both Xavier and Sheikh for, please, can you hear me? Because I kind of feel I'm talking to myself.
Yes. I hear you.
I'm still struggling to get used to this virtual way of doing things when you only see your own computer in front of you. But I thank very much Xavier and Sheikh for the broad overview that they've given us. And what I will do as a discussant is only focus on two areas that they brought out and to try and use those two things to ask the question about, therefore, what do we do in the context that we are now about the AfCFTA? The first thing I think is in Xavier's point that actually when you think about the challenges that confront Africa's integration in terms of the economy, they have much, much more to do with the real economy and the constraints the real economy, including productive capacity, supply side constraints, and much less to do with tariff and trade liberalization. So that even though tariff and trade liberalization is important, it's important to locate that within the capacity to produce and how we sequence those two things. And I think that Sheikh finished by telling that it's not enough to just go and bring somebody to make cars, but we have to focus on what are our own real livelihood needs. So that's something that they share in common that I think is important. The second area are the specific issues and problems exposed of Africa's situation by COVID. And therefore, what are the real things that we have to address? And whether or not the AfCFTA, as we have them now, approach those two things. Now, if we combine the question of the real economic challenges that trade faces in Africa and the questions of the immediacies of COVID's priorities, the question that I would like to pose is simply this. How do we rethink both the direction in which we are taking the AfCFTA now, but also more importantly, the process, the pacing, and the sequencing of the various elements of the AfCFTA. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes to try to elaborate these things. But I'd like to put this in context, in the broader context of what Third World Native Africa, but more importantly, the Africa Trade Network and civil society organizations have been saying about the AfCFTA since the negotiations were launched, and especially since they became hot negotiations in 2016. Because I think that those things are important, and in fact, they are getting more and more relevant now. And the first point is this: as all of us agree, we think that Africa's continental economic integration is critical for Africa. Critical for Africa, especially in a global situation which is becoming more and more hostile. In a global situation where the big powers are trying to build their own, serve their own needs first before they get to anybody else. So it's critical for us to build our continental integration for that purposes. But that integration, therefore, means that, and again, everybody has talked about it, it requires that integration to be the engine for the transformation of our economies as they are now, because we are integrating the global economy as primary commodity export dependent economies. So Africa's integration is important in order to allow us to change the terms of our engagement with the global economy. Now, we also accept as Africa Trade Network that market integration would involve at one point some element of liberalization of trade and therefore removal of tariffs. So the Africa Trade Network has always made it clear that when it comes to the Africa's integration, we are not saying that there must be no liberalization of trade at all. That's not an argument. Because we know the African economies, we know the way they relate to each other, how they are created and they sell to the market. The question really is what kind of liberalization, right? And the issue is, in that context and challenge in the examination of liberalization, how does that liberalization contribute to a market integration, and more importantly, to a transformation of Africa's economy in the way that builds Africa's capacity to address the productive problems that Ambassador and Sheikh are focused on. And we think that the two tests that the AfCFTA must meet, both in goods, services, investment, all across the board. First of all, are we creating a market for African producers and for African goods in the African market, primarily? Or are we creating a market so that we can continue to import goods from somewhere, whether it's from Canada, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, China, everywhere? That's the first question. The second question that we all recognize, and Ambassador has used the data from UNCTAD, which can be completed by saying that most of the value add creating enterprises in Africa belong to the small, medium, and relatively large domestic economies and enterprises. So for instance, in West Africa, the enterprises that create most jobs are the local manufacturers of wood, furniture, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and things like that, which don't export outside Africa, but export to the region. So a CFTA which helps us to transform our position in the world must be one that privileges building up and broaden up the small, medium, and relatively large enterprises, whether they are in food production, in manufacture, in industrialization. These will be the engines. And our issue, therefore, is to look at whether or not what we have so far as a framework meets these two tests. Now, I mean, our argument as is Africa Trade Network has been that if you look at the way things are set now, we are not quite sure that the kind of interface between tariff removal and deregulation that must be in place, that the interface between deregulation and therefore building domestic capacity has been well thought of. And both Sheikh and Ambassador have emphasized the question of rules of origin. What qualifies as an African product rather than a product from Italy? What qualifies as an African tomato rather than tomato brought from Italy and put in a tin in some village in Ghana, for instance? But actually, the questions of rules of origin are even much more critical in the area of services than they are in the area of trading goods, because as we all know, over 30 years of autonomous liberalization imposed on us by structural adjustment has led to the situation where most of our service industries have actually been liberalized, so much so that you have a lot of non-African producers and providers of services. In fact, in Ghana, there was a time when even rubbish collection was done by companies from Canada. And as a result of this autonomous liberalization, there's a lot of entrenched non-African providers of service. Even providers of service who look like African are not African. There was a time when everybody else believed, for instance, that EcoBank, La Banque Pan-African, is very African. But if you begin to look at the share ownership, you can see that much of it is much more non-African. Now, how do you talk about rules of origin in the context of services so that when we open our service sector, it is not to foreign providers of tourism and things like that? Those questions have not even been looked at for now. So our fear really is that the kind of necessary policy situation, the kind of information, the kind of thinking that should go into the process of thinking through AfCFTA that will make it precisely an instrument for reorganizing Africa's economies is lacking at the moment. And in a certain sense, we are rushing out of it. So this problem about whether we are actually meeting Africa's needs has become even more directly, kind of sharply illustrated by the COVID situation. And I don't want to take too much time, so I'll just spend the last minute just give an example of what I think is starkly posed. Take the question, for instance, of COVID and the need for medicines. Take the question of vaccines. I mean, as we all know, whether you are anti-vaxxer, whether you belong to one of those people in America who don't want to have vaccination touch your skin, or whether you think that vaccination is the solution to all problems, one day, vaccinations will be developed, vaccines will be developed, and it will be part of the toolkit of managing a return to some form of normalcy. We do know, however, that it is likely, given how things are going now, that a vaccine may be developed by all the big pharmaceutical companies in the West, and maybe China, and maybe some other countries now. From what we know of how things are going, like for instance, Donald Trump has just bought off all of the current allocation of remdesivir. And apart from the fact that he has been going on to the high seas and taking up people's orders, from what we know, whether we talk about people's vaccine or vulnerable people's vaccine, or we have principles for making sure that vaccines come to the vulnerable, it is most likely that when a vaccine is developed, that vaccine, African countries and Africa's vulnerable people will be at the long end, the end of a long chain, having access to it. If African countries are going to do something about that vaccine problem, they have to do two things. First of all, they have to make use of the rights that they have under the WTO, the TRIPS and Public Health Declaration. For instance, to issue compulsory license, need be, to also manufacture vaccines in their own place, if need be, so that they can also, when the vaccine comes, be sure that they can produce it in quantities to meet the needs of their people, rather than wait for the generosity of others. Now, to do that, you need two things. First of all, whether we have the legal regimes available in African countries that they have then translated their rights under the WTO into their local law. We know that South Africa, thankfully, has got a very sophisticated national regime that can do that. I don't know about, I know that Ghana some time ago was also trying to develop its laws. I don't know about, countries in other parts of Africa, but I know that there has been, even under the WTO agreement, there have been attempts by the European Union and America and co to try and discourage many countries from even applying the local law to uphold those rights. But even if you have that right, the question then, do you have the local manufacturing capacity? Now, South Africa may have some capacity. We know that Nigeria has got one of the biggest pharmaceutical local industry in Africa. So even if we are going to have the capacity, it requires some kind of coordination between South Africa, between Ghana, between Senegal, which have also got some pastel institutes and stuff like that. It requires what I would call a policy coordination around many things. Now, the reality is that, think about the scenario. COVID has made pharmaceutical and vaccines a priority thing. That priority requires coordination among African countries. Now, working on that coordination will have nothing to do with the AfCFTA. Whether you implement the AfCFTA today or you implement it next year, whatever the agreements as they are now will not help you develop the vaccine capacity. Developing the vaccine capacity is actually a question of public health authorities and national governments in Africa coordinating policy in the real sector in pharmaceutical industry. What we have in the goods protocol is just to create a market. Creating a market doesn't take you anywhere. And in fact, I'm quite happy that maybe we are not in the position of negotiating an intellectual property element of the protocol yet. Because in terms of what I saw in 2016 about some of the templates that were being promoted for the investment chapter and the intellectual property chapter, they were worryingly cut and paste templates from outside, which would have ended up reinforcing the same severity of intellectual property rules. So in a certain sense, what I'm suggesting is that if you look at what we have today and what COVID is exposing, it requires a different level of coordination among African countries at the policy level, at the real sector level, the kind of coordination that is not what is within the grand vision of the AfCFTA. What does that mean? And I'll conclude from there. It means, therefore, that COVID is asking us to ask new questions about what really is our deficits. Have we built the real sector, substructure, infrastructure, coordination among African countries? Have we built a relationship in our African industrial, common industrial strategy? Have we built a relationship and taken into account the CADEP, the agricultural policy? Have we built relationships and taken into account about financial? Have we built those things which will be the soil on which we can talk about an FTA? I fear we haven't. And even though we always, all of us, refer to the AfCFTA as a fulfillment of the long-standing vision of Africans for integration, I dare say that the way in which we are going about the AfCFTA actually is a break from the kind of conceptualization that we had in the Abuja Treaty, for instance, which thought that it was important to build a lot of harmonization of policy on the ground first before you liberalize trade. And it seems to me that if we are going to try and go from here to a post-COVID area and begin to think AfCFTA, we must begin to think about this real sector coordinations first. After all, even the European Union, they are thinking about coordinating procurement of public PPEs and medicines. They know they have a market, but if they don't coordinate those things as active governmental things, they are not never be able to make sure that the market is best for them. So probably to end, Jane, the question simply is this. We do know that the AfCFTA is just a market liberalization element of a whole panoply of things that we must do in Africa to build integration. We know that integration is important for us so that we can, as Africans, survive better in a more hostile world, which is becoming more and more hostile. We do know that for that integration to be important, it must energize our productive capacity and domestic production. We know that COVID has told us that there are some priorities of actual action on the ground that we have to take. And we do know also that some of the things that we are discussing in the AfCFTA at the moment, from the trickiness and problems of rules of origin, from the fact that we are liberalizing 90% of the product so that bigger players may even swallow smaller players. From all those things, probably we need a somewhat more fundamental questioning both of what we have and how we are going. And in that sense, therefore, I'll raise the question back to Sheikh and Xavier, because when Xavier concludes by saying that the AfCFTA and its implementation will take us toward the realization of the integration in the current context, to what extent does he think, and to what extent are the participants, if they have questions, think about the kind of rethinking that is necessary? And Sheikh also, Sheikh has talked a lot about, maybe you have to suspend the thinking. He has talked about the fact that it's not simply giving us time, but we must use the time productively. I'd like to challenge about them about how does that use that time to build the presence and capacities of domestic producers as a driving element of an AfCFTA. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tete. Thank you so much. And I think that question on that table, really, are we looking at implementing, or are we going, should we go back on the drawing board to conceptualize the CFTA? There are a number of questions. We are running out of time. There are a number of questions. Peter asked some questions to Ambassador Xavier. What's the roadmap to reach agreement on rules of origin that UNECA is advocating to include e-commerce in phase 2? What's your opinion? Can you provide, Amani has also asked, can you provide significant examples of proposals which may constrain developing countries' industrial policy space? There were also questions regarding the whether it's the AfCFTA should become a WTO member. There was issues around loss of applied duties of the REX, that this might also constrain the ability of regions to join the CFTA. I'll give, how many minutes? I will give 2 minutes each to Ambassador Karim and to Sheikh to give us closing remarks, but also answer those questions, but also the questions which are coming out of Tete's presentation. Tete, very good, very, very good presentation. But for me, it has left me asking what next? Where should we go? Should we go back on the drawing board? What are the next steps? So over to you, Ambassador Karim, and then after, Sheikh, you take the floor.
Well, thanks very much, moderator. And I think won't be able to answer all the questions in full. But really, it's been, I think, the presentation from Sheikh and from Tete, input from Tete has been really excellent. Let me just try to come to the questions a little bit more directly where I can. On the question about a roadmap for the rules of origin, we've done our own calculation, and it seems that already we've got an agreement on around 68% of the rules of origin at a detailed level, at the level that you would make a tariff offer. Our understanding, our sense is that another 15% of tariff lines, of rules of tariff lines that where there are rules of origin that would need to be agreed, would probably be achieved relatively easily with some focused attention, but we haven't got to those. And it seems that there's another around 20% or 18% of lines that are more difficult from a policy point of view, from an industrial development point of view, where we're going to have more difficulty in getting agreement. And I'm talking about the rules of origin when we need to talk about clothing and textiles. There's some divergences on sugar and autos, for instance. South Africa does have an auto industry. So there's a roadmap. I mean, we've got a kind of an idea of it. The question is the timing of getting to those engagements, given the fact that many of us can't travel and meetings are not being held. There was a question on the kinds of restrictions, WTO restrictions on policy space for industry. And one would need to look at that obviously in a lot more detail than we can now, but you would start looking at that from the point of view of the kinds of tariff offers that countries made in the Uruguay round, the level of bindings that they undertook. You'd need to look at the kinds of subsidies that countries had used in the past as they tried to support their industries, and whether or not those types of support mechanisms are still available under the WTO. Many of them are now prohibited. You'd have to look at the trade-related investment measures agreement and to see to what extent that closes off some capacity or some policy measures to support domestic industry. And you'd have to look at intellectual property rules and the extent to which they limit the technology transfers that's needed for upgrading, industrial upgrading. The Tete, I think, has clarified the challenges really very well. In the AU 2063 agenda, it says clearly that market integration is just one part of the integration project. There are many, many other things, but that is one part. There's an infrastructure program to link up our economies, roads, rail, and others. And it talks about improving our work on coordinating on industrial development. And some of the answers have already come up in the meeting, but it's a much more complex set of challenges than agreement on a tariff schedule for tariff liberalization. It's relatively easy in any trade negotiation to say your tariffs will come down to zero over a certain amount of time, and it must be 60%, 80%, 90%. That is relatively easy to do in terms of the complexity of that. But the real question that Tete is asking is that that process on the market integration agenda seems to be moving ahead of what we should be focused on, which is building up capacity in the real economy. And that's a question I think that we have to really grapple with. At the end of the day, a lot of the balancing between building domestic capacity and having access to regional markets will be contained in the kinds of offers that countries put on the table. And I think what I'm hearing from the colleagues is a big question is the level of ambition that we've set ourselves for tariff liberalization in the AfCFTA. 90% to come down to zero over 5 years. Is that enough, or is that too tight? Then we're supposed to agree on another 7% to come down to zero in the next 5 years. Is that too tight? That will be a big question. And I think the idea of sequencing and phasing comes into conceptualizing how the level of ambition in terms of your tariff liberalization and the time to phase it down. So very, very important question that we still have to grapple with. Tete also raised that we need the COVID-19 requires us to think differently, a different paradigm. I think, but with those elements in it, I think if we were finding the right balance between opening our markets to one another to create space to grow, but also finding enough space to protect domestic industry from being swallowed up by big industries within Africa, the bigger economies in Africa, that's going to be critical. But another critical element is how our trade policy stance to the rest of the world. Because as we look at a big market in Africa, other countries outside of the continent are also looking at our market. So we need to be aware of that dimension as well. And maybe the last point that I would pick up on is the notion that Tete has raised about rules of origin in services. And I think this is something that we need to think about much more carefully. One of the big problems in all of this is that we do tend to import frameworks and approaches that have been constructed elsewhere in different contexts and are not necessarily appropriate in terms of where we are in Africa, in terms of where we need to go. So stronger rules of origin in services, requiring that the benefits of opening up services trade in Africa accrues to African service providers is going to be critical. So I think this is a good start to the discussion. I think this is ongoing. And I know that there is pressure always on the negotiators to move forward on all of these, but I think a proper balance approach to the different components of an integration project need to be struck. So I'm really very pleased to have heard from colleagues.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Karim. Before I go to Dr. Sheikh, Erica, your hand is up. Maybe if you could ask your question. Erica, if you can unmute, yes, please go ahead, Erica.
Thank you very much, Jane. Can you hear me well?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Thank you. So thanks a lot to all the speakers. It has been a very useful discussion. My name is Erica. I'm from Mozambique. And I would have a specific question or comment for Dr. Karim. So as we move towards regional integration, we understand that one of the objectives of this regional integration would be to avoid or overcome the race to the bottom that we see in many global South countries, in particular in Africa, where we have been witnessing a weakening and diluting human rights standards and environmental legislation, or even through reforms to land tenure legislation, always with alleged objective of fast-tracking development and investments. We are also aware of how dependent many African countries are financial institutions, World Bank, and so easy to their structural and reforms destroy livelihoods of small cashew nut producers. It seems desperate for investment. How do you work as civil society wins to that as a criteria when to decide which kinds of investments and industries are beneficial to our economies? So just, I would also like to comment that as the negotiations around the AF's advance, and as you are aware, there's also an ongoing process at the UN to legally binding instrument on and human rights. It's been a very strength of this process since the beginning. So they're trying to make a statement that regulatory frameworks evolve, including in the way in which we hold corporation investors account harmful impacts and be a priority for the bigger economies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Erika, for those questions. I would like to request Ambassador Karim to briefly, maybe in 2 minutes, to answer, to respond to the issues raised by Erika.
Unfortunately, there was a break in the audio during that. I'm not sure I heard the full question. What I did pick up on is the, well, a kind of a broader question about human rights in this. I mean, I think the quick answer to that this is not an issue that is part of the AfCFTA negotiation per se, but of course, these are issues that are taken up in the broader AU security and other parallel processes. Of course, there are linkages to all of this. What I did pick up, what I did hear was talk of, I mean, I think I heard a mention, made a reference to the UN binding instrument being discussed in Geneva. And we've been broadly supportive of it from a South African point of view. I think for us, how this relates to the AfCFTA work is around the approach that we would end up taking with respect to the investment chapter, which was supposed to be adopted next year, but of course it's going to be delayed. And the approach that we're taking there, of course, has to take a different path to the types of investment protection agreements that we've had in the past. South Africa has terminated the old bilateral investment treaties. We're looking at an approach to investment protection that takes up some of the main issues that that have been raised, including giving it greater profile to human rights, to the objectives of sustainable development, etc. And this is reflected in our national legislation, new national legislation on investment. And so we would see that when this conversation starts and this dialogue starts to emerge at the Africa level, we don't simply cut and paste what is being developed elsewhere, that we have something that reflects a different perspective and a different approach to protection of investment in Africa, including with respect to the type of arbitration that would be perhaps part of an overall framework. So there's a big debate on that, but that maybe is just a quick response. I hope at least I went some way to answering the question.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Karim. Sheikh, I give you 2 minutes to be able to respond and also make your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. It will be very short. I think there is no direct question to me, but what I just want to add, following Ambassador Karim and also the very good comments from Tete, that we should just know that for AfCFTA, as we are all saying that we should change our paradigm as a kind of doing a paradigm shift, we should go this way and know that we will not find the world where we left it before the COVID-19. We should know that changes will be very important, because even if the sanitary crisis perhaps in month or 1 year will be resolved, the crisis will be in the economy will be there. So we have to change our options and better assess our agreement to see how it will be helping us to go in the direction of the real economy, what I call the economy of life, because it is the most important for Africans. So if they do this way, I think we can find some solutions to come out very stronger, because we are going to a world where the balance of power will be more and more and more important in the global trading system. This trade war perhaps will be coming very strong. So together with a good AfCFTA, and also seeing how going to the WTO back, we will be more stronger by coming together. And looking in ECOWAS countries, we are discussing on how ECOWAS can become a member of WTO, because now it's a custom union. How to do it, we are going this discussion. We can also have the other African regions becoming a WTO member. So later on, when we will finalize AfCFTA, when we will have a CET in Africa, looking on how Africa also will be becoming a member of that. So this is just what I wanted to add to the comments already made, and which are very, very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those closing remarks. We are running out of time. My duty now is to conclude our webinar. Very, very interesting webinar. It has raised so many questions I don't want to go into given the very short time remaining, but there are so many unanswered questions, and maybe specifically, Peter, we are sorry, your question wasn't answered about e-commerce and whether it should be included in the in phase 2. Those are the issues which are going to be addressed in the subsequent webinars, which we are going to announce, and please participate. Let me take this opportunity to thank you, all of you, the participants. A number of participants brought in comments which enriched the debate. I would like to thank TWN for organizing this very good webinar. We need it at this material time, and I think we need the next webinars also to be able to understand this issue and be able to chart collectively a way forward. I would also like to thank, on behalf of the organizers, to thank Ambassador Karim. Thank you so much for taking time off and for being able to give us such a very great presentation. And also to Sheikh, Dr. Sheikh Dear, thank you again for a very, very good presentation. We do appreciate. The presentations will be shared out, maybe on the TWN websites. I hope everybody of you gets the presentations. Thank you also, Tete, for a very good discussion. So many issues, which you brought out, so many of them. And I wonder whether we have time to be able to address all those issues in the next webinars. So from TWN, from ATN, thank you so much, all of you, and do keep safe, and let us meet in the next webinar. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.